Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary secrets. What would you do if you discovered that the quiet woman you'd been working alongside for months was carrying a burden so heavy it could break most people? What if her silence wasn't rudeness, but survival? What if behind her tired eyes lay a story of sacrifice that would make you question everything you thought you knew about strength? This is the story of Jake Martinez, a drifter cowboy who thought he'd found just another temporary job at a small ranch in Montana. He was wrong. What he found was a woman named Sarah Chun, a mystery wrapped in worn denim and calloused hands. She never spoke about her past, never mentioned family, never explained why she sometimes disappeared for hours without warning. Jake minded his own business. Cowboys learn early that everyone has secrets, and smart men don't go digging where they're not invited. But some secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially when four small faces appear at a ranch gate one desperate evening, calling out "Mama" to the woman Jake thought he knew. What Jake discovered that night would transform not just his understanding of Sarah, but his entire life. Because sometimes, when you think you're just showing up for work, you're actually walking into a story that will redefine what family means, what love looks like, and what it truly takes to be a hero. Jake Martinez had been drifting from ranch to ranch for the better part of 3 years, ever since his divorce papers were signed and his ex-wife took everything except his horse, his truck, and his stubborn pride. The Broken Arrow Ranch in northwestern Montana seemed like every other temporary stop along his meandering journey through the American West. The pay was fair, the work was honest, and, most importantly, nobody asked too many questions about where he'd come from or where he was headed next. The ranch stretched across 4,000 acres of rolling grassland, bordered by pine forests and cut through by Silver Creek, which ran crystal clear even in the heat of late summer. Owner Tom Bradley was a straight-talking man in his 60s who'd inherited the property from his father and had been working it for 40 years. Tom's wife had passed away 5 years earlier, and their only son lived in Seattle, showing no interest in ranch life. Tom hired seasonal workers to help with the cattle, fence repairs, and general maintenance that kept a working ranch operational. When Jake pulled up to the main house that Monday morning in March, his horse trailer rattling behind his dusty Ford pickup, Tom came out to greet him with a firm handshake and a measuring look that Jake had learned to recognize. Ranch owners could size up a man pretty quickly, and Jake had gotten good at presenting himself as reliable, hardworking, and temporary. He wore his experience in the way he carried himself around horses and the practiced ease with which he handled basic ranch equipment during his brief demonstration. Tom offered him a position on the spot. The job would last through October, maybe November if the weather held. Jake would earn $800 a week, plus room and board. He could stable his horse in the barn and park his trailer behind the equipment shed. Tom explained that there were currently 3 other workers on the ranch. 2 were brothers from Wyoming, Pete and Danny Kowalski, who'd been coming to Broken Arrow every season for 6 years. The 4th worker was someone Tom mentioned almost as an afterthought. "There's also Sarah," Tom said, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun. "She's been here since last November. Good worker, keeps to herself mostly. You won't have any trouble with her." Jake nodded, not particularly interested in details about his co-workers. He'd learned that ranch life worked best when everyone focused on their jobs and respected each other's privacy. Some people came to ranch work because they loved the lifestyle, others because they needed to disappear for a while. As long as everyone pulled their weight, the reasons didn't matter much. He met the Kowalski brothers that evening at dinner. Tom's housekeeper, a friendly Mexican woman named Rosa who'd been with the family for 15 years, cooked meals for the ranch hands in the main house kitchen. Pete and Danny were good-natured men in their 30s who treated ranch work like an extended camping trip, full of jokes and easy camaraderie. They welcomed Jake warmly, sharing stories about previous seasons and offering practical advice about working on the Broken Arrow. Sarah Chen appeared just as they were finishing their meal. She moved quietly through the kitchen, filling a plate with the remaining food and nodding politely to the men seated around the wooden table. Jake's first impression was of someone trying very hard to be invisible. She was small and compact, probably in her early 30s, with straight black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of deep tan that came from months of outdoor work. Her clothes were worn but clean, faded jeans, work boots, and a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm evening. "Sarah, this is Jake Martinez," Tom said. "He'll be working with us through the fall." Sarah looked up briefly, meeting Jake's eyes for just a moment. "Welcome," she said quietly, her voice carrying a slight accent that Jake couldn't immediately place. Then, she took her plate and disappeared toward the back of the house, where Jake later learned she'd been given a small room in what used to be Rosa's quarters before Rosa had married and moved to town. Over the following weeks, Jake settled into the rhythm of ranch life. His days started before dawn with feeding and watering the horses, followed by whatever tasks Tom had assigned for the day. Sometimes it was checking fence lines, riding the perimeter to look for breaks or damage from winter storms. Other days involved moving cattle between pastures, medicating sick animals, or maintaining equipment. The work was physically demanding but satisfying in a way that Jake had missed during his brief attempt at construction work in Colorado. He found himself working alongside Sarah more often than the Kowalski brothers, partly because Pete and Danny preferred to work as a team on their assigned projects, and partly because Sarah seemed to gravitate toward the jobs that required less conversation. She was an excellent worker, Jake discovered. She had an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that allowed her to move herds efficiently with minimal stress to the animals. Her rope work was precise, her horse handling was gentle but firm, and she never complained about difficult or unpleasant tasks. What struck Jake most about Sarah was her complete focus on whatever job she was doing. Whether she was cleaning water troughs, repairing fence posts, or treating an injured calf, she gave each task her full attention. She wasted no motion and made no small talk, but she wasn't unfriendly. When Jake asked direct questions about the work, she answered clearly and helpfully. She just never volunteered anything personal or engaged in the casual banter that usually filled the long hours of ranch work. The mystery of Sarah's background became a quiet puzzle in Jake's mind, though he was careful not to let his curiosity show. The Kowalski brothers had mentioned that she'd arrived at the ranch the previous November, during one of the worst early winter storms Montana had seen in years. Tom had found her on his doorstep one morning, half frozen and asking for work. She'd had no references and very little ranch experience, but she'd been willing to learn and desperate enough to accept whatever wage Tom offered. "She's running from something," Danny had confided to Jake one evening when Sarah was out of earshot. "You can always tell. People don't end up on remote ranches in the middle of winter by accident." Jake had nodded noncommittally. He understood running from something. Most of the people he'd met in 3 years of drifting were carrying some kind of baggage, whether it was a failed marriage, financial problems, legal troubles, or just a general dissatisfaction with conventional life. The unwritten code of ranch work was that everyone deserved a fresh start, no questions asked. But Sarah's case seemed different somehow. It wasn't just that she was private, it was the way she carried herself, like someone who was constantly listening for something. Jake noticed that she always positioned herself where she could see the ranch's entrance road. During meals, she sat with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. When they were working in the fields, she would occasionally stop what she was doing and scan the horizon, as if expecting to see something or someone approaching. Her work schedule was also unusual. Most ranch hands worked from dawn until dusk, with breaks for meals and brief rest periods during the hottest part of the day. Sarah kept those hours too, but Jake noticed that she often disappeared for an hour or two in the late afternoon, always with some explanation about checking on something or running an errand. Tom never questioned these absences, which suggested to Jake that whatever arrangement Sarah had made with the ranch owner was more complex than a standard employment agreement. The phone calls were another mystery. The ranch house had an old landline phone in the kitchen that was primarily used for ranch business, but Jake occasionally noticed Sarah using it during her break times. She always kept these conversations brief and spoke in such a quiet voice that even standing nearby, Jake couldn't make out what she was saying. The calls seemed to follow a pattern, always around the same time of day, always lasting just a few minutes, always ending with Sarah looking somehow both relieved and worried. One afternoon in May, Jake was in the barn checking on a mare who'd been favoring her left front hoof when he overheard part of one of Sarah's phone conversations. She was standing just outside the barn door, and in the quiet of the early evening, Her voice carried more clearly than usual. I know, baby, I know, she was saying, her voice thick with emotion. Mama's working hard to fix everything. Just be good for Grandma Chun, okay? I love you so much. Jake remained perfectly still, realizing he'd stumbled onto something intensely private. The conversation continued for another minute, with Sarah speaking in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language, Chinese, Jake thought, though he wasn't certain. When she hung up, he heard her take a shaky breath before walking back toward the house. That night, Jake lay in his narrow bunk in the trailer, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what he'd heard. Sarah had children. She was talking to them regularly, but they weren't with her. The reference to Grandma Chun suggested they were staying with family, but why? And why was Sarah working on a remote ranch in Montana instead of being with them? The pieces of the puzzle began forming a picture in Jake's mind, though he was careful not to make assumptions. Sarah was clearly in some kind of trouble or difficult situation that had forced her to leave her children with relatives while she worked to fix everything, as she'd put it. The way she watched the road, her reluctance to share personal information, and her obvious emotional distress during phone calls all suggested that whatever she was running from was serious enough to require this kind of sacrifice. Jake found himself paying more attention to Sarah over the following days, though he was careful to maintain the respectful distance she clearly preferred. He noticed that she seemed to have good days and bad days, probably corresponding to the phone calls with her children. On good days, she worked with something approaching contentment, humming softly to herself as she moved through her tasks. On bad days, she was efficient but mechanical, going through the motions of work while her mind was clearly elsewhere. The weather in late May brought a series of thunderstorms that made outdoor work impossible for several days. The ranch hands spent their time in the barn, maintaining equipment and organizing supplies. The forced proximity led to more conversation than usual, and Jake found himself learning small details about Sarah's life despite her general reticence to share. She mentioned that she'd grown up in California, though she didn't specify where. She'd learned basic horsemanship from an uncle who'd worked on a ranch near Bakersfield. She was particularly knowledgeable about vegetable gardening, which she'd apparently learned from her grandmother. She spoke fluent Spanish as well as what Jake now recognized as Mandarin Chinese, skills that made her useful when dealing with Rosa and some of the seasonal workers who came through the ranch. What she never mentioned were the children Jake had heard her talking to, or any family members other than the uncle and grandmother she referenced in passing. She wore no wedding ring and made no reference to a husband or partner. Her emergency contact information in Tom's files listed only a phone number with a California area code, which Jake had noticed when Tom was updating the ranch's insurance paperwork. By June, Jake had developed a routine of working alongside Sarah that felt comfortable for both of them. They developed an efficient partnership for many ranch tasks, communicating with gestures and brief words rather than extended conversation. Sarah seemed to appreciate that Jake didn't push her for personal information, and she gradually became less guarded around him, occasionally making small jokes or observations about their work. It was during one of these more relaxed moments that Jake made his first real mistake. They were repairing a section of fence near the creek, working in comfortable silence as they stretched new wire between posts. The late afternoon sun was warm on their backs, and Sarah had been humming a melody that sounded like a lullaby. Without thinking, Jake commented on it. "That's a pretty song," he said. "Is it something your kids like?" The moment the words left his mouth, Jake realized his error. Sarah's entire body went rigid, and she dropped the wire stretchers she'd been holding. She turned to face him with an expression of such raw panic that Jake immediately raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry. I just overheard you on the phone once, and I thought." "You don't know anything," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "You can't know anything. Do you understand?" The intensity of her reaction told Jake that whatever situation Sarah was in was more serious than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about privacy or personal boundaries. She was genuinely frightened by the idea that anyone might know about her children. "I understand," Jake said carefully. "I don't know anything, and I won't say anything to anyone. Your business is your business." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Finally, she nodded and picked up the wire stretchers, but The easy companionship they'd been developing was clearly damaged. For the rest of that day, and several days afterward, Sarah reverted to her earlier pattern of minimal interaction and careful distance. Jake kicked himself for his carelessness. He'd been around enough people with secrets to know better than to let someone know they'd been overheard in a private moment. His curiosity about Sarah's situation had overcome his better judgment, and now he'd made her more frightened and isolated than she'd been before. It took nearly 2 weeks for Sarah to begin trusting Jake enough to work comfortably with him again. During that time, he was extra careful to respect her privacy and to demonstrate through his actions that he could be trusted. He never mentioned their conversation by the creek, never asked personal questions, and never gave any indication that he was paying attention to her phone calls or absences from the ranch. Gradually, Sarah's guard came down again, though Jake sensed that she was now more aware of what she said around him. The easy moments of shared humor became less frequent, but their working relationship remained effective. Jake found himself protective of Sarah's privacy in ways that went beyond simple politeness. When the Kowalski brothers made casual comments about her mysterious background, Jake deflected the conversation. When Tom mentioned in passing that Sarah seemed distracted lately, Jake assured him that her work remained excellent. As summer progressed, and the ranch work intensified with haying season and cattle rotations, Jake began to understand that whatever Sarah was dealing with was getting worse rather than better. Her phone calls became more frequent and more emotional. She started having trouble sleeping, and Jake could see lights on in her room at all hours of the night. Her appetite decreased, and Rosa began expressing concern about how thin Sarah was getting. The breaking point came on a sweltering day in early August. Jake was returning from checking water levels in the eastern pasture when he saw Sarah sitting on a bench outside the barn, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jake's first instinct was to keep walking and pretend he hadn't seen anything, but something about the complete despair in her posture made him stop. He approached carefully, as he might approach a frightened animal. "Sarah, is everything okay?" She looked up, her face streaked with tears and her eyes red with exhaustion. For a moment, Jake thought she might tell him to go away, but instead she seemed to crumble further. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I thought I'd have more time, but things are getting worse, and I can't keep them safe from here." Jake sat down on the bench beside her, maintaining careful distance, but offering his presence. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Unless you know someone who can make a person disappear completely, or unless you have $50,000 lying around, there's nothing anyone can do." The specific mention of money suggested to Jake that Sarah's problems were financial, possibly involving debt or legal issues. The reference to making someone disappear indicated that she was afraid of someone specific. Combined with her concern for keeping them safe and her separation from her children, Jake began to understand that Sarah might be dealing with domestic violence or some other form of serious threat. "Sometimes talking about a problem can help you think of solutions," Jake offered carefully. "I'm pretty good at keeping secrets." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing risks in her mind. Jake could see her trying to decide whether the relief of sharing her burden might be worth the risk of trusting someone. "You don't understand," she finally said. "If he finds out where I am, if he finds out where they are, he'll kill us all. And I'm running out of places to hide." The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Jake felt the weight of Sarah's words settling into his understanding, reshaping everything he thought he knew about her situation. This wasn't about financial problems or legal troubles in the conventional sense. This was about survival, about a woman trying to protect herself and her children from someone who wanted to hurt them. Sarah seemed to realize she'd said more than she intended. She wiped her eyes quickly and started to stand, but Jake spoke softly before she could flee. "How many children do you have?" The question was gentle, without any hint of judgment or prying curiosity. Sarah hesitated, her body caught between the impulse to run and what Jake sensed was an overwhelming need to finally tell someone the truth. "4," she said quietly, sitting back down. "4 babies, and they're 600 miles away, living with my grandmother because I can't keep them safe." Jake felt something twist in his chest at the raw pain in her voice. He tried to imagine what it would take for a mother to leave 4 children with relatives while she hid on a remote ranch, working 16-hour days for minimal pay. Whatever threat she was facing had to be severe enough to make that sacrifice seem like the only option. How old are they? Jake asked. Emma is 8. The twins, David and Daniel, are 6, and Lucy is 4. Sarah's voice softened as she spoke their names. Emma tries to take care of the little ones, but she shouldn't have to do that. She should be playing with friends and learning to ride bikes, not worrying about whether Mama is ever coming home. What happened? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the general outline of the answer. Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and distant, as if she was recounting someone else's story. I married Richard when I was 22. He was older, successful, charming when he wanted to be. My family thought I was lucky, a good Chinese girl marrying a wealthy American businessman. They didn't see what happened when we were alone. Jake had heard variations of this story before. During his marriage, his ex-wife had volunteered at a women's shelter, and she'd shared some of the stories that had haunted her. He knew enough to stay quiet and let Sarah continue at her own pace. It started small, Sarah continued. Criticism about my cooking, my clothes, my friends. Then, it was control over the money, the car, the phone. By the time Emma was born, I couldn't leave the house without his permission. By the time the twins came, I couldn't talk to my family without him listening to every word. She paused, staring at her hands. Jake noticed for the first time that there were faint scars on her knuckles and wrists, the kind that came from defensive wounds. I tried to leave twice before. The first time, I took Emma and went to my parents' house. Richard came after us with lawyers and police reports claiming I'd kidnapped his daughter. He had money and connections, and I had nothing. I ended up back home within a week, and things got worse after that. The second time? Jake prompted gently. The second time was after Lucy was born. Richard had started drinking more, and the violence was escalating. I was afraid he was going to seriously hurt one of the children. I managed to save some money over several months, and I took all 4 kids to a women's shelter in Sacramento. Sarah's voice began to shake again. We were there for 3 weeks. I thought we were safe. The shelter had security, legal advocates, counselors. They were helping me file for divorce and get a restraining order. But Richard found us anyway. He had private investigators, security cameras, people watching everywhere I might go. One night, he broke into the shelter. Jake felt his jaw clench involuntarily. The image of a man violently pursuing his family into what should have been a safe haven was almost too much to bear. He didn't take us back that time, Sarah continued. He was too angry. Instead, he had me arrested on charges of kidnapping and child endangerment. His lawyers claimed I was mentally unstable, that I'd taken the children without cause and put them in danger by living in a homeless shelter. They had doctors who testified that I was paranoid and delusional. But surely the shelter staff could testify about what really happened, Jake said. Sarah shook her head bitterly. Richard's lawyers argued that the shelter workers were biased and that their testimony was unreliable. Meanwhile, Richard presented himself as a concerned father trying to protect his children from an unfit mother. He had character witnesses, financial records showing he could provide for the children, medical experts who said my injuries were self-inflicted. Jake was beginning to understand the impossible situation Sarah had been trapped in. Domestic violence cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when one party had significantly more resources than the other. The system that was supposed to protect victims often ended up re-traumatizing them instead. What happened to the children during all this? They went to live with Richard while the legal proceedings were ongoing. I was allowed supervised visits twice a week, 1 hour each time, with a court-appointed social worker watching every interaction. Emma started having nightmares. The twins became aggressive and withdrawn. Lucy stopped talking almost completely. Sarah's voice broke completely at this point, and she buried her face in her hands. Jake wanted to offer some kind of comfort, but he sensed that touching her would be unwelcome. Instead, he waited patiently for her to continue. The supervised visits lasted for 6 months while lawyers argued about custody and criminal charges. Richard's legal team kept filing motion after motion, claiming I was violating the restraining order he'd managed to get against me, arguing that I was a flight risk, presenting new evidence of my supposed mental instability. Every court date got postponed or continued. Every delay cost money I didn't have and kept me away from my children longer. "How did you get the kids back?" Jake asked. "I didn't," Sarah said quietly. "Richard dropped the criminal charges and agreed to shared custody, but only if I accepted his terms. I could have the children for 2 weeks every summer and 1 weekend per month, as long as I lived within 50 miles of his house in San Francisco and submitted to regular psychological evaluations. He would have primary custody and make all decisions about their education, medical care, and religious upbringing." Jake felt a surge of anger at the fundamental injustice of the arrangement. "But you must have had some legal recourse." "My legal aid lawyer advised me to accept the deal. She said that if we went to trial, I might lose parental rights completely." Richard's lawyers were threatening to argue for supervised visitation only, claiming I was dangerous. The psychological evaluations they'd forced me to undergo had been conducted by doctors Richard's team had chosen, and their reports were not favorable. Sarah stood up and began pacing in front of the bench, her agitation growing as she relived the legal nightmare. "So I agreed to their terms, thinking I could at least see my children regularly and maybe build a case for getting them back eventually. For 8 months, I followed every rule. I lived in a tiny apartment in Daly City. I worked 2 jobs to pay for the psychological evaluations and the court-ordered parenting classes. I showed up for every scheduled visit, brought the children gifts I couldn't afford, tried to maintain some kind of relationship with them despite having less than 20 hours a month together." What changed? Richard got remarried. His new wife was young, beautiful, and very interested in playing house with an instant family. Suddenly, Richard didn't want me to have even limited access to the children. He started documenting every interaction during my visits, looking for any excuse to claim I was inappropriate or harmful. When I gave David extra attention because he seemed sad, Richard's wife reported that I was showing favoritism and potentially damaging the other children psychologically. Sarah's pacing became more agitated. When I brought Lucy a doll for her 4th birthday, they claimed I was trying to manipulate her emotions and undermine the parenting decisions they'd made. When I asked Emma about her schoolwork, they accused me of interrogating the children and trying to turn them against their father. Jake could see where this story was heading, and it made his stomach clench with dread. Richard filed another motion asking the court to eliminate my visitation rights completely. His new wife testified that the children were becoming increasingly disturbed after spending time with me. They had new psychological evaluations done that concluded I was a destabilizing influence on the children's development. The court-appointed guardian ad litem recommended that my parental rights be terminated entirely. "Jesus," Jake breathed. "My lawyer told me the case was hopeless." Richard had spent more than $200,000 building a legal record that portrayed me as dangerous and unstable. I had no money left for expert witnesses or private investigators. The children had been living with Richard for over a year by that point, and the court was reluctant to disrupt their established routine. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face Jake. "So I made a choice. I violated the custody agreement and took my children." Jake felt his heart start beating faster. This was the part of the story that explained why Sarah was hiding on a remote ranch in Montana instead of fighting for her children through legal channels. "I couldn't let them take my babies away forever," Sarah continued, her voice fierce despite her tears. "I couldn't let Richard win completely, especially when I knew he didn't really want the children. He just wanted to hurt me. So I picked them up for what was supposed to be a weekend visit, and instead of bringing them back, I drove straight to my grandmother's house in Los Angeles." "How long did you have with them?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks where I could hold them whenever they needed comfort, where I could cook their favorite foods and read them bedtime stories, and just be their mother again. Emma started smiling. The twins began playing together like they used to. Lucy started talking again. The temporary happiness in Sarah's voice made what Jake knew was coming even more heartbreaking. But Richard found us. He'd hired private investigators the moment I didn't return the children, and he'd had my grandmother's house under surveillance for years in case I tried something like this. The police came at 5 in the morning with a warrant for my arrest, and court orders for the children's immediate return. Sarah sat back down heavily, all the fight seeming to drain out of her. They arrested me in front of my babies. Lucy was crying and trying to hold onto my legs while the officers handcuffed me. Emma was screaming that I wasn't a bad person and begging them not to take me away. The twins just stood there looking confused and terrified. Jake felt moisture in his own eyes as he imagined the scene Sarah was describing. The trauma of that moment for both mother and children was almost unimaginable. I was charged with kidnapping, custodial interference, and violation of court orders. Richard's lawyers argued for the maximum penalties, claiming I was a flight risk and a danger to the children. The prosecutor offered me a plea deal. If I pled guilty and agreed to relinquish all parental rights, I would get probation instead of prison time. You didn't take it. I couldn't. Signing away my rights to my children would mean I'd never see them again, never be able to protect them if Richard hurt them, never be able to tell them that their mother loved them enough to fight for them. So I went to trial. Sarah's voice became mechanical again, as if she was reading from a legal document. I was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years probation. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order requiring me to stay at least 500 feet away from Richard, his wife, his home, the children's schools, and anywhere the children might be present. Jake was beginning to understand the impossible trap Sarah found herself in. So you can't see your children at all now? Officially, no. If I violate the restraining order in any way, I go to prison for the full 18 months plus additional charges. Richard made sure the legal paperwork was airtight. I can't contact the children directly. I can't send them letters or gifts. I can't go anywhere they might be. But you've been calling them, Jake pointed out. Sarah nodded. My grandmother has the children. After I was arrested, Richard decided he didn't actually want 4 young children disrupting his new marriage. He allowed my grandmother to take temporary custody while the legal situation was resolved, probably thinking it would be easier than dealing with them himself. That's something, at least. It's not enough, Sarah said fiercely. My grandmother is 78 years old and in poor health. She's doing her best, but she can't handle 4 active children indefinitely. Emma is having to help with everything: cooking, cleaning, taking care of the twins. And Richard could change his mind at any time and take the children back. The custody arrangement is entirely at his discretion. Jake was starting to see the bigger picture of Sarah's situation. She was caught between multiple impossible choices, with no good options available through legal channels. So you came here to figure out what to do next? I came here to disappear, Sarah corrected. After I got out of jail, Richard's private investigators were following me everywhere. They documented every place I went, every person I talked to, every job I applied for. Richard's lawyers were building a case to have me declared a habitual criminal and a permanent threat to public safety. Sarah stood up again, but this time her movements were less agitated and more purposeful. Tom Bradley is my grandmother's second cousin. When I called her crying about not knowing where to go or what to do, she remembered that Tom had always said family was welcome at the ranch if they needed a place to get back on their feet. She called him and asked if he could use an extra worker for the winter. And he said yes without asking questions. Tom is a good man. He knew I was in some kind of trouble, but he didn't pry. He gave me a job, a place to live, and, most importantly, he paid me in cash so there would be no paper trail for investigators to follow. Jake was impressed by the network of people who had helped Sarah, even with limited information about her situation. It spoke to both her character and the desperate nature of her circumstances that people were willing to take risks to help her. What's the plan now? You can't stay hidden forever. Sarah's expression darkened. That's the problem. I've been sending money to my grandmother to help with the children's expenses, but it's not enough. She needs help with medical bills, and the kids need clothes, school supplies, everything that growing children require. I've been working extra shifts and saving every penny I can, but I'm still falling short. Is that what the $50,000 you mentioned is for? Sarah nodded. My grandmother's doctor says she needs surgery that her insurance won't fully cover. Without the surgery, she might not be able to continue caring for the children. If that happens, Richard will take them back, and I'll lose any chance of ever having a relationship with them again. Jake felt the weight of Sarah's predicament settling over him like a heavy blanket. She needed money she couldn't legally earn without revealing her location. She needed to be close to her children, but couldn't risk being found by her ex-husband's investigators. She needed legal help, but couldn't afford lawyers capable of fighting Richard's well-funded legal team. There has to be some way to fight this, Jake said. Domestic violence organizations, legal aid societies, someone who specializes in cases like yours. I've tried everything, Sarah said wearily. The restraining order makes it illegal for me to contact most advocacy organizations on my own behalf, since they might have connections to the children's case. The few lawyers I've been able to consult with say that my criminal conviction makes it nearly impossible to regain custody rights, especially against someone with Richard's resources. Sarah sat back down beside Jake, her exhaustion evident in every line of her body. The worst part is that I know Richard doesn't really want the children. He's using them as weapons to hurt me, to prove that he has complete control over my life even after our marriage ended. If I could somehow disappear completely, permanently, he'd probably lose interest in the children within a year. But I can't abandon them, and I can't fight him from where I am now. Jake found himself studying Sarah's face as she spoke, seeing past the exhaustion and despair to the fierce determination that had carried her this far. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the seemingly impossible obstacles she faced, she hadn't given up on her children. She was still fighting, still looking for solutions, still willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to be their mother again. What if there was another way? Jake asked slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. What if,